Good morning. My name is Chris Taylor. I'm a supervisory chemist with the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory, Department of Defense. Several months ago, I got a pirated copy of the Trace Evidence Symposium and saw they were looking for speakers for the NAS report. Immediately emailed Director Melson, who promptly responded, yes, he was interested. I thought I'd pretty much did a good thing for the Trace Evidence Symposium. I was done. I got a speaker for him. 3 weeks ago, I get the tap on the shoulder that someone backed out of the accreditation certification. They knew I was coming here, so I'm here. I am honored to be on this panel and speak with you today. Why certification, accreditation, proficiency tests? Similar to what Dr. Salyard's mentioned, if you search the NAS report, certifications mentioned 128 times, accreditation 162, and proficiency or proficiency test 88 times. Again, you'll see a lot of overlap in this presentation with the standards and the ethics, education and training. Again, it's a good thing that there is that overlap. Again, we have consistency throughout the forensic community. Just like the other speakers, I want to go through a little bit about what the NAS report mentioned. I believe probably the one statement that is most quoted out of that NAS report is this kind of stick in your eye. Most disciplines still lack best practices or any coherent structure for the enforcement of operating standards, certification, accreditation. Definitely get your attention and what we need to do about that. Almost all the recommendations, all 13 of them mention certification, accreditation, proficiency tests at some point or another. The ones you see bold here are the ones that probably most heavily talk about these areas. If an overarching organization is established, they see them providing oversight to accreditation and certification. Again, reports of terminology, reporting and testifying, standardizing those. Again, it's as part of the accreditation certification process, utilize model laboratory reports. Just like mentioned by some of the other speakers, some of the starting points here is what does a suitable standard protocol look like? What does a model report look like before we can move forward with some of these other aspects? Summary or recommendation number 6, establish standard protocols for forensic examination methods and practices. A particular needs exist for routine mandatory proficiency testing that emulates a realistic representative cross-section of casework. And I'll talk about thoughts on proficiency tests in a little bit. Recommendation number 7 is probably the most critical to this working group. And that is basically, in a nutshell, mandatory certification, mandatory accreditation. And again, the other recommendations do have some impact, including ethics. And again, part of applying ethics is part of that training piece, part of that certification of our examiners. Basically, what we're trying to do here is gather information at this point. New term for me, data collection instrument will be used in lay terms. That's a survey to me. Basically find out what's out there and what needs to improve on this process. And again, who certifies the certifiers, who accredits the accreditation agencies, who proofs the proficiency test providers. Gather that information, and again, similar to the other speakers, a top-down approach, look at what's out there and what we can leverage off of existing programs. The 3 areas, again, that was broken down to, again, they had licensing on there, but the subgroup so far has talked about just combining that with certification. What are the minimal requirements for certification? Again, I'm not going to present any solutions or answers here. This is basically to get folks thinking, so when this data call is sent out, membership participation is asked for. Some of these thoughts are across your mind. What is a certification process composed of? What's the test look like, and who develops these? Does the certification become mandatory or a condition of employment? What is a forensic laboratory for accreditation? Under the ASCLD guidelines, if you haven't been on their website, a forensic laboratory is one person that performs analytical analysis, that performs opinions or conclusions for legal matters. We're trying to gather who's accredited out there and who's not, basically, and maybe find out why they're pursuing accreditation, and what existing accreditation standards need to be out there. What we have now is suitable, or is it an opportunity to improve on those? Same thing with proficiency tests. Who develops those? What's out there right now suitable? The NAS report mentions realistic cross-section of casework proficiency tests. What's that look like? We said folks are familiar with CTS and now the other providers that are out there. Do we need to bring back blind proficiency testing? Do we need to make these proficiency tests more similar to casework samples? Part of this process is, again, not only looking at the overall what exists, but then what gaps that are out there. What gaps are out there in a broad forensic community. Again, this is not just covering what we may think is traditional forensics, latent prints, firearms, trace evidence, drug chemistry. But some of this report addresses, again, crime scenes to forensic nursing, to the other areas, anthropology that are out in the community. Again, similar to the ethics community, what's out there in accreditation certification bodies. Again, if you're familiar with the FSAB, Forensic Specialties Accreditation Board, who recognizes several of the organizations out there to certify examiners. And when in your spare time, when you're reading and preparing for ISO 17025, drop down one ISO standard to 17024, which is a ISO standard for, again, crediting certification bodies. And what proficiency test providers are available and what proficiency tests are needed. Again, how many folks out here, especially in the trace evidence world, have to end up making their own proficiency tests because not all the subdisciplines are covered. Cost analysis. This was a fun one as our subgroup started meeting. You start realizing what potentially this could cost, especially when you think of certification. Certification, if someone does multiple areas in the lab, again, multiple proficiency tests, professional development costs to maintain that certification. Again, is there any personal employee costs? I'm sure everybody's organization covers every society you belong to and every function that you want to attend. And so a lot of this is, again, applaud those folks that have paid their own way to meetings and have paid their own way to obtaining their certification. I felt like, as a trace evidence examiner, talk a little bit about the challenges for trace evidence. I do feel when you look at maybe not so much accreditation, but certification and proficiency tests, trace evidence discipline, trace evidence examiners, I believe, are unique. We do a broad science, instrumentation, different subdisciplines, and this may be a challenge for this community when these things are potentially adopted. I copied out what the NAS report recognizes as some of the subdisciplines. I also threw in the NIJ what they recognize as disciplines. But probably the most valuable one that's out there right now is ASCLD. And again, I did learn something on Monday in one of my workshops. The recognized ASCLD Lab International and ISO categories are fire debris, explosives, gunshot residue, paint, fibers and textiles, glass, hair, and according to Mr. John Nooner, waiting for approval is then the catch-all category of general chemical and physical analysis. So any of those that I didn't mention, like you might notice that soil wasn't on there, lamp filaments, would fall under those general categories. Is that suitable? Is that acceptable in this in the forensic science community to have just those categories? Or again, does trace evidence need to subdivide subdisciplines even further? What trace evidence certification programs exist? We're all familiar with the ABC general knowledge exam, now called the comprehensive exam. There are a handful of specialty examinations out there in the trace evidence field. How many other specialty exams need to be created? Do we need to create an overarching trace evidence examination so you get certified in trace evidence, and then possibly maybe get licensed in the subdisciplines? Again, all things for discussion. Be interesting where that heads. Proficiency test providers, again, I mentioned earlier that the discipline, trace evidence discipline, I know I find myself making several of the proficiency tests up for my examiners for ones that don't exist out in the field or recognized by ASCLD or FQS. And again, this is a cost to the organization. I think trace evidence could be one of the broadest costs to organization. Just imagine one individual certified goes out and obtains certification in 5 different areas of trace evidence. Do they have to take 5 proficiency tests a year? What professional training to maintain that certification? The studying for each one of those subdisciplines. Again, the trace evidence will have an impact and definitely a cost to the organization. And then what are the roles of the scientific working groups? Again, as mentioned already, the SWIGs are actually mentioned in the report. I'm sure we're going to lean on those or leverage the existing work in those. Again, for the trace evidence community, what additional SWIGs need to be developed to develop these standards and certification requirements and potentially recommendation of proficiency tests. And we all heard earlier in the week, as one of the board members of the newly created American Society of Trace Evidence Examiners, again, what role could that new organization play in developing of these standards? Again, as a yesterday, became a co-chair. I'm not sure what that all involves yet. I'm honored that the folks in our work group and the folks in this organization pointed in my direction, and I'm certainly proud to be a trace evidence examiner. And again, I'm sure I'll represent the federal government, Department of Defense, in the way of trace evidence. But then again, as we send out our data call out to the forensic community, the trace evidence community, again, we need your participation. Definitely, folks up here, including myself, do not have the answers on the way forward. And again, look forward to interaction from all of you. Thank you.